So our next section is going to be covering the new monarchs and breaking them up into England and France is in our first one, and then we're going to go to Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. In addition, part of this chapter, we're going to be covering the Age of Exploration, which is very exciting, and understanding that outside of the continent, right, Europe is going to be beginning to be in contact with many different types of peoples and cultures all over the world. Okay, but the concept of the new monarchs is still focused during the Renaissance era. So even though we're covering it after, this is all still taking place at the same time that we've studied in the last chapter. So it's important to understand that we are learning by themes, not just chronologically as well. Okay. Some background information about the new monarchs. Around this time, right, 1450 to 1550, Europe is a very diverse place, right? For the most part, we can say that politically and geographically, you have these huge empires in the east. You can see the Poland and Lithuania with Russia and Hungary, and then you have a lot of different principalities and city-states in the center, and then in the west we have these emerging nations. Overall, there aren't any nation states. Like, people didn't see themselves, I'm part of this nation. They were more focused on how they saw themselves locally and regionally. And there's really no dominant powers that's saying, "Oh, this is the most powerful empire right now." For the most part, it's quite balanced. Fragmentation is very normal in terms of there was no political unity. And so one thing that we understand is that up until this point, central governments have been very weak. Now, are there kings? There are, right? But it's not like they're very dominant until the new monarchs are coming here onto the rise, and we're going to be going over a few of them today. Um, so the fact when there's weak central governments, okay, your society, your country around you oftentimes will break off into war, specifically civil war, because there's feuding nobles, okay, different factions, different social classes that will be fighting each other, and there is no way to stabilize it and maintain peace unless you had a king, okay. So certain rulers will try to impose a type of peace to really direct the focus and the strive for power in their country through their leadership. And so these new monarchs are going to be the ones that are going to be laying down the foundation for these nations to rise up and be powerful. Okay, so how will a state be built up? Essentially through diplomacy, right? Relations between other countries and leaders, marriage, establishing marriages that will bring unions, and also just declaring war and conquering other lands. The thing about the new monarchs is that they never achieved absolute power. Okay, so new monarchs are not absolute monarchs. That's not going to happen until another 2 centuries, another few centuries in 17th century, where we're going to see in France with Louis XIV is finally where you can say this is an example of absolute monarch, whereas the new monarchs were unable to achieve that much power. Many of the new monarchs definitely are Machiavellian in the sense where Machiavelli says the prince is the agent of change, right? And true state formation and power is going to come through the leader, and sometimes it causes them to be ruthless, but at the same time they're looking to be the most efficient and also doing things in secrecy and not being so open to the public. Okay, what's important to know about new monarchs as well is that they are the ones where law and order is going to come through, and they're very aggressive in their methods, right? Very Machiavellian. The end justifies the means, and so whatever it takes, they're going to reduce the power of nobles, and so they're going to be taxing the nobles. If they're uncooperative, you'll confiscate their lands, and so what would they do with the money? Well, collecting tax money allows them to hire more mercenaries and establish their own standing armies and train them, right, and equip them. And so this was more effective, as we said before, than having knights that are your cavalry that aren't as effective anyways. Okay, another thing new monarchs were known for was that they had hereditary power, right? We talked about primogeniture, and um, by establishing an heir to the throne, this is going to take away power from the aristocracy and the clergy, because we know that the king will always hold that place, right? Royalty is superior in that sense. One thing in medieval type of thought is that the church was always trying to triumph over the king, but the thing is, no longer will these monarchs tolerate that the Pope is above him, but we're going to see slowly they're going to be looking to be either on equal grounds or even stronger than the church, than the Catholic Church. Okay, new monarchs are going to create what we call efficient bureaucracies. A lot of times they're going to start opening up different types of institutions and organizations and have officials that work for them, and they're going to be the ones that are maintaining their country, collecting taxes, doing all that kind of stuff, just making sure that the government is running strong. And by having bureaucracies, what we call the centralizing of power, right? The central government. We have bureaucracies in our country, right? And so the government is the one who runs, the schools, runs, the postal service, DMV, right? And then so bureaucracies exist, with our Congress and our governors and state governments and stuff. They exist in order to run things for the country, the state. Okay. At the same time as they're spending money as a government, right, national debt is going to be rising because now the nation is spending the money, right, and so they're going to need to take loans from the merchant bankers in order to have more funds rather than just taxing. Interestingly so, the middle class is going to be become more influential under the new monarchs, and that's because that the townspeople, at the expense of nobles, were given some power. And the reason why is that many middle class feel like parliaments and just the barons and nobles were too powerful and they're being kind of oppressed. And so easily the king is going to reach out to the middle class and say, hey, are you willing to support me? And the bourgeoisie, the middle class, is going to offer revenues to the crown as well in supporting them. And so this is kind of a kill two birds with one stone, right? You support the middle class, right, and you kind of get some money out of them, right? You have the ability for them to trust you, and also you're reducing the power of the nobility as well. Okay, kings, especially those that are on the European continent, looked to Roman law, like kind of how they saw the Roman Empire, and with the emperor is the one who is the supreme ruler, and the king was majesty, right? The king was sovereign over all things, and that's what a lot of these new monarchs wanted to achieve. They wanted to say that if a king established a law that made a law, right, they're going to enact it out, they're going to empower it and enforce it, and whatever the king says goes. And that's essentially their goal, is to be like building an empire to that extent. However, there is going to be opposition. It's not going to be so easy for these new monarchs to come on the rise. Obviously, nobles are the number one enemies to the monarch, and they're going to always try to struggle and pull back their power as much as possible. Clergy members as well, have their allegiance to the Pope, and they don't want to be serving the king above the Pope. And they feel like that's where their ties are, and so that's going to be a struggle for power for them too. And we're going to see the consequences of that. And also independent towns that had their own charters and their own rights and that kind of stuff, they're not going to want to be part of the government's control, right? They don't want the government to be too centralized. They want to hold on to their rights. Okay, so what we're seeing is that the centralization of the countries in the West, it's going to look a little different, right? So for England, it's going to come through administration. For France, it's going to come through just some fortunate events, some lucky things that happen to them. And in Spain, it's going to come through a really important marriage. In the Holy Roman Empire, it's going to be unsuccessful because they're so localized and split up, and they're not going to be able to unify. Okay, but we're just focusing on England and France today. Okay, so with England, the new monarchs, a little bit of background. England is an island, right? And so they have the English Channel and the North Sea that separates them and provides barriers for them. And so Britain is looking to develop their own heritage, not just on the island, but eventually be an influence upon the continent. And they're very different from other states because it's not easy to just have foreign invaders come into their country because they have the barriers of water, right? Um, the War of Roses, a really important war, and this is a civil war between two major noble families. You have the Yorks and the Lancasters, and the Yorks are going to be called the White Roses, and the Lancasters, they have the emblem of the Red Roses. And in the end, long story short, the Yorks win, and Henry VI at the time was under the Lancasters, and they overthrew him. The thing is, the Yorks could not keep it, and eventually you have the Tudor family that are from the Lancaster side take over, right? And so Henry VII is going to be the Tudor that will defeat Richard III of York and eventually become king. The thing is, England is in shambles. Okay, so what will Henry Tudor or Henry VII do? Okay, so Henry Tudor had to put together England himself. Because the status of the monarch was so bad in England and the aristocracy were so powerful, that he had a lot of problems that he had to deal with. Okay, legend has it that as he said, that he actually picked up the crown from a bush, right? Like he actually that's how unimportant the monarchy role was. Like no one really cared for the crown that much. People would fight for it, but it really held no power. So he had two main problems. The first problem was the power of the nobles. So for one thing, he marries Elizabeth of York. So even though the Yorks were the rightful heirs, right, by bringing this together, he and his wife actually have, share the power, and so any legitimate claims to the throne, it's kind of been pushed to the side and saying that, I have obviously under my family, the Tudors and the Lancasters, and then you have also the York. So establishing that unity in that sense through this marriage is as an example what he would do. And how would he actually take care of the nobles is that he would pass these laws that would go against livery and maintenance. Livery and maintenance essentially means that a lot of nobles who had their own armies, right, would signify that, this is my army, right? And they would have a certain emblem or a coat of arms that shows that they serve that army. And so Henry VII actually passed laws against that, not allowing them to have their own private army. So when you don't have your own private army, you cannot protect yourself. Okay, so that's one thing that's really important. Another thing is that he created the Star Chamber, as you see in this image, right? It's essentially a new court system that has stars on the ceilings, and it represented the power of the king, and it's kind of like a private courtroom, right? And the king is the judge, and there is no jury, and this was kind of like an interrogation room where you kind of force the nobles to do what you say. You can you can call them out, you can blame them for things that they probably didn't do, and really threaten them, right? And so it was really an instrument that Henry VII used, and also Henry VIII will also use as a way to rule with an iron fist, kind of like a despot, but it provided order, right? It provided stability, and that's how he would actually subdue these nobles. In addition, he would have new peers. Okay, so Henry VII is going to have a new noble class. He's not going to just go the regular nobles that he's always had relationships with, but he's going to invite those of the middle class or those that are of a lower nobility, okay, to work for the Tudor dynasty, and they would be given official titles. When they're given these certain positions and offices, now they're required to serve and be loyal to Henry VII and the Tudors, and if there's any other nobility that are trying to cause a rebellion, right, these of the new peers are the ones to be most loyal and support him and take care of those other rebellions that are happening, right? So basically finding a new group as your posse, as your entourage to protect you. The second problem is that English kings had financial issues, right? So the problem was that the monarch was essentially poor, and it didn't have a real way to make money for himself. And so English kings were known that they were required to live of his own. So whatever property or estates that they had to live off of whatever they earned. So it's not that they can tax freely because Parliament is there, and so Parliament said that if the king ever wanted to tax, right, it must get approval from Parliament, and Parliament doesn't want to support taxes, right? Like that's them, like they would have to pay taxes themselves. So that's something that they don't always allow. They would not pass these laws for tax. And so over time, these English kings had to manage their estates more efficiently, and Henry VII would figure out how to do it. But his solution was to create a central administration, right? And so by creating these institutions, he can oversee royal lands more efficiently, not under his eye, but he would have ministers and officials sent out. He would have them collect royal dues, right? And he would change the type of laws and customs requiring it. He would hire accountants and have a lot of bookkeeping, record keeping, and this would make sure that every penny was accounted for. And he can squeeze as much out of whatever he owned, right? Because he has to live off of what he owned. The fact that the amount of financial resources was so limited, it really put a strain upon the type of policies he can set domestically and foreign, compared to France, where France tax as much as you want. That's the power of the king, and we're going to see Henry VIII that comes after this to be successful in terms of being able to take away lands from the church. So with France, the idea of having a new monarch bring a central government and to unify France as a country was more of a matter of luck. And as far as the aristocracy in France, it was much larger in England because the War of Roses really reduced the number of nobles around in England. So France faced a few problems. Okay, one was that around France they had a lot of aggressive neighbors, England being one of them, and Burgundy to the east side is another. They also had princes within France that were always striving to be taking over the throne, and they did not want to have one king essentially to rule them all. They didn't like royalty. They had their own duchies. Okay, and there was this thing called provincialism, where many people would prefer to serve their province, as you can see these different provinces on the map, over the state, right? They felt loyal to the local leader rather than this national leader. And lastly, it was the regional difference on language. So in northern France and southern France, they didn't really understand each other, and even the king would need a translator to really be able to communicate throughout the southern lands. Okay, so those are some of the problems of why France couldn't unify, but the monarchy will become stronger after some of these major events. Well, we know that France won the 100 Years' War, and after that, right, even though it was very costly, they were able to rebuild politically and economically. In the end, right, France wins, and so the contest of England trying to take over the throne in France is no longer an issue. And England is officially expelled after the 100 Years' War. And then you have Burgundy, which is a duchy to the east. And so they were related to the kings of France in the sense where it's the House of Valois. Okay, so the Valois family, they were both in the royal family in France and also in Burgundy. And over time, Burgundy is going to be stronger. Right, they're going to be more affluent. They're going to have their own little renaissance, and they're going to unify their lands together. But in the end, these Swiss towns, out of their own defense, were able to take out a lot of the armies of Burgundy. And so France saw that once Burgundy lost, right, they're very weak. France would absorb Burgundy, and that's what we're talking about as a matter of luck, right? It was not because France was able to take down the armies in Burgundy, but it was the Swiss towns that acted first to work together to take down Burgundy, and then Francis came in and just swept them. Okay, what's important to know is that what's significant about the French kings, right? They had the power to tax without getting consent of Parliament. That's one thing I mentioned. And the second thing is that they didn't really have a check on power. They didn't have a constitutional monarchy or even any official document like the Magna Carta that said the king has limited power according to the nobles. Okay, so the French king is already kind of set up in a position that's a lot better. King Louis XI is going to be one of our first new monarchs we're going to talk about in France. He's from the Valois line, and essentially, when he inherits the throne, he only has a small territory around Paris. But he is going to be able to centralize his power through a few ways, right? He has inheritance, marriage, war, being deceiving, and establishing his own army. Okay, so he's going to be the first to establish a national army. He's going to actually recruit all different social classes to contribute to the national army. He's going to get a cavalry from the nobility. He's going to get infantry from the towns. And he's going to be centralizing the control, but keeping armies in certain regions. Okay, the tax money that he gets also is allowing him to fund this army that he's trying to build. He's called the Spider King because a lot of times he is very deceptive, right, and cunning in the sense where people underestimated him. He didn't even look like a king. He's not wearing a crown. He's wearing a hat, right, and he doesn't look very royal at all. But a lot of times he will lure nobles into different plots, and then he would kind of like trick them in taking their land. And whenever he found out certain estates had no male heirs, he would take those too, and he would set up certain arranged marriages where he would be finally in control of certain fiefs that eventually consolidate all of his lands together. Okay, in the end, the taxes was probably the most powerful way for him to rule, and the different types of taxes were always set upon the third estate. The first estate is essentially the clergy. The second estate are the nobles, and the third estate is everyone else. And so the clergy and the nobles being exempt from it, that was something because they were always so powerful at that time, it was hard to change that. And so the third estate was always the one that's being pounded and pounded time again from getting taxed, from being taxed. So the first tax is called the gabelle, okay, and this was a salt tax, and this was most needed because you need salt not to cook, but to preserve food. They didn't have fridges back then. The second tax is the taille, and this is the tax on land. And so any landowners, they had to pay, except for second and first estate. So third estate had to pay that. And then you have the ad. This is the tax on wine and meat, and so it's essentially a sales tax. Okay. Also, Louis XI is known to be able to control the clergy and the bishops. And this is one thing that is rather unusual because usually it's the Pope that's in charge, but he begins to take more power in France over French clergymen. So Louis XI had a son named Charles VIII, and his focus was really not to essentially unify France, but to just build up his property, his estates, his control slowly by acquiring more land. Over time, there could be certain military campaigns that he was a part of, or inheritances or marriages. One event was the wars in Italy. Charles VIII was the one that was invited by Milan to go invade, and so he brings in 25,000 troops. Florence eventually is going to surrender. The Medicis are going to be overthrown. The Papal States are going to be taken, and eventually Naples can be conquered without a real battle, right? So Italy, we talked about, was very fragmented, and from that could not face the strength of these kings. And so with 25,000 troops, 8,000 of them were Swiss, and we saw the images, the image of the Swiss pikemen, right? the forest of pikes and polearms, and eventually he is going to be defeated and kicked out. Spain is going to be the one to kind of trick Charles VIII from taking Naples, and he's going to lose that too. Sadly, he has no surviving children, and his cousin or his son-in-law is going to be taking over, who is Louis XII. But the greatest failure of Charles VIII, essentially, was when they wanted to control the territory in the Low Countries. So, Low Countries is going to be Denmark, um, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Okay, and so the Burgundian Low Countries at this time was owned by Burgundy, and there was a marriage between Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian of Habsburg, which brought the Valois and Habsburg rivalry to a greater height, and from that, the Valois and Habsburgs are going to be duking it out in Italy from this point on. Okay. Then you have, as I said, Louis XII that takes over. He's not that important because he's not a great example of a new monarch. He actually was called the father of the people because he supported lower taxes and he created reforms, and he actually is going to be part of losing Naples to Spain. And through that, he also does not have an heir, and so his cousin, Francis I, all still under the Valois line, is going to become king, right? And he's actually known for being a rival to these other two guys, Charles V and Henry VIII. They are all starting off as kings very young, and they're going to be fighting wars against each other. There's going to be a lot of conquests, and over time, it's going to be kind of a balance of power. If you imagine, it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors between the three, and constantly there's competition between them. So we're going to see this France, England, and Spain rivalry. And one of the major areas of rivalry is going to be Naples. So Italy, we talked about, is the battlegrounds of Europe, right? They're being stomped on. And this goes back a little bit in terms of France once had control of Naples, but after they agreed to share it with Spain, Spain eventually was able to take it all, and so this makes France very upset. And so there's this kind of rivalry and competition between now Charles V of Spain, right, and Francis I of France, and that's the issue. And then a new event comes up, which is the election for the new Holy Roman Emperor, and so who is it going to be, right? And so they're both kind of vying for it, and this is because Maximilian who was the previous emperor, is going to pass away, and eventually Charles is going to be taking the throne, even though Francis is the one that's actually trying to like buy and bribe people for it, and he fails to do so again. So that kind of is like another like hit to him as a king. One thing about Francis, though, is that he did establish the Concordat of Bologna, and this was an agreement between him and Pope Leo X at the time, where the King of France is able to appoint the bishops within France, right? The French bishops to their positions. And from that, the Pope agrees that if I give you this authority, I should be able to receive the income of these bishops in the first year of their service. Okay, and so the significance isn't so much about the money in a sense, but it's more about the French kings now have an official agreement in saying that they can appoint these positions, and this is going to be a huge blow to the influence of the papacy in France, right? They're not going to feel like they're really listening to them anymore because the king can call the shots in terms of who is in the clergy. And this is another reason why France did not completely turn Protestant during the Reformation.